Good morning, everyone. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for being here in this session with us. We will start by introducing ourselves, but before we do that, we just wanted to give you a bit of orientation on how we've thought about structuring this session. First of all, you will see that we are all three practitioners, and this session will be very much about sharing with you the work we're doing and what we're learning and what we are seeing on this topic of biodiversity and how to, I think we have the title maybe now, if we could have the presentation. Maybe not. So maybe we can start projecting. So we will start by introducing ourselves, and then we will give short presentation on each of our practices and how we do it. Some are within the farming context, some are within the forestry context. And then what we would like to do is share with you some of the thoughts we've had and some of the recommendations that we started drafting. And we would very much to have the second part of this session to be very engaged with you, to get your thoughts, your questions, but also your views on what kind of recommendations we should be making on this topic. I think now we, maybe the one before, if you don't mind. Oh, it's us. We have it. Or not?
Yeah, with three picture.
Okay, fine. Yes, right, exactly. So this topic is a fantastic topic, and I think we're all, you will see on stage here, very excited about the topic of biodiversity, specifically maybe more soil biodiversity, but biodiversity in general. And about how to enable it and how to make revenue generation with it so that we can sustain it more. And I think that's really the goal, is to sustain these better practices, these ecosystem restorations. And so we will share how we do this, what we see working, where we see challenges, and how together we can make recommendations for the fuller group. Maybe we start now with a quick introduction. Do you want to start, Paul?
Sure, yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Masarczyk. I work for a project developer, regenerative agriculture project developer in the Czech Republic called Carboneg. And I'll be talking about how we treat rewards and incentives for farmers to incentivize biodiversity enhancing practices.
I'm Gianluca Bagnara, nice to meet you, from Italy. I'm partner in a family farm that is Cà Colonna. It's a commercial farm, but we managed to organize around us also an ecosystem of innovation, like we heard during the plenary section. And so we collaborate, we have a collaboration for innovation on farm experimentation with FAO, university, and so on. But basically we have a commercial farm. We have some experience in organic carbon, and now we have managed also to evaluate the role of biodiversity in the soil. Thank you.
And I'm Axel Ducos. I work for Land Life. We are a nature restoration company in the context of forestry. So we restore very degraded land with new native natural forests, and biodiversity has always been at the core of how we think about our work and put it in practice, and I very much look forward to sharing this with you today.
So, I have put together a presentation just describing the work that we do at Carboneg, and I've called it towards holistic regenerative rewards, so how we can actually promote life-enhancing and biodiversity-enhancing practices within carbon farming.
I'm covering things.
This is a very different session. You can see it's very casual. We're all sitting on stage. We're friends here, so let's keep that energy moving around. So firstly, what is it that we do at Carboneg? So we help farmers transition to regenerative agriculture. How do we help? Well, we create know-how. We create sort of communities of sharing within Czechia and Slovakia, and we provide financial rewards through carbon credits. The transition that we're talking about here is to regenerative agriculture. So we, by and large, use 6 principles, which I'll describe to define regenerative practices. This comes from people that have thought much longer about this topic than I have. Gabe Brown, for example, in the US is a big proponent, and we use a lot of his work. And We also then help to reduce costs, increase yields, and increase resilience for these farms. We are Czech-based, as I mentioned. We have a global footprint, so we operate in a number of countries outside of Europe as well. And our main form of revenue is through selling carbon removal credits under ISO and with gold standard forthcoming as well. So these are the principles of regenerative agriculture, and this is something that I find quite interesting, this distinction that some people make between carbon farming and regenerative agriculture. How do they overlap? How are they different? Maybe I won't go into too much detail about these, but there's some basic principles that we like to, we try and help farmers to promote. And the idea is that these are also, they should be holistic. You can't just do one and not the other, because you really lose some of the benefits. This is a sort of symbiotic system that needs to be thought of as a whole rather than small little incremental pieces. But obviously you can implement them incrementally, but to just do one and not the other it doesn't have quite the same impact. I think one that I'll highlight here is observing the natural laws and the context from with the environment that you're working from. I think that's really important when it comes to regenerative agriculture. There's no one-size-fits-all approach that you can just apply in different continents or different contexts. And that's something that we're trying to engage with quite deeply at Carboneg. Okay, so what is unique about our approach? There's many project developers here at this conference. What sort of distinguishes Carboneg? The one thing is that we are focusing on measure and remeasure. So we don't do any modeling. We do actually annual samples, and we try and create rewards annually for farmers. We only focus on removals, so we don't actually quantify any reductions and issue them as credits. We just focus on carbon removals in the soil. And we have what we call a regenerative index, which is basically a mechanism that we use to incentivize farmers to do more than just the bare minimum. So we try and collect information about the practices that farmers have done that are life enhancing. For example, you might plant cover crops, and that's a binary. Did you have cover crops or not? We try and increase the reward to farmers for the number of cover crops that they planted or the diversity of those crops. And yeah, that's, I think, quite a unique approach that we have. And maybe I can just quickly talk about some of these co-benefits that we're describing of regenerative agriculture. So firstly, there's a lot of benefit with regards to water, preventing erosion and allowing for water to be stored and absorbed by the soil. Obviously, there's soil health improvements, which reduces the need for chemicals. And there's huge biodiversity improvements. If you're reducing the amounts of plant protection products or agrochemicals, you can increase soil life and also other species within that area. So I'd now wanted to talk quickly about some of the challenges that the current framework or the current paradigm that we has for project developers that are trying to work more holistically. And I'd like to cover 3 topics here. So the first one is this idea of carbon blindness. That when we think about sustainability, often in, let's say, in ESG circles, in boardrooms, we're only focusing on a tiny tunnel vision of carbon. So we think that if we deal with the carbon problem, then all of our other sustainability challenges will somehow magically be resolved. And unfortunately, this isn't actually the case. Sustainability challenges that we're facing are systemic. They're interconnected. They're mutually enhancing. So if we just focus on carbon, we don't think about biodiversity or other forms of nature protection, I'm afraid that we might be focusing on the wrong thing. It's an interesting reflection for me because carbon farming, for example, is quite a strange emphasis for even this conference, right? To think about what we're doing or what we're trying to do as just farming carbon. I don't know if anyone else finds that weird, but that's a weird thing for me to be focusing on. It's like, and to have this as a conference or to have a summit on carbon farming feels like having a fintech summit called the Ones and Zeros Summit, right? It's like, sure, that's, the ones and zeros are important, but you're really missing the big picture here. Like, if we're just focusing on the carbon, there's so many other aspects that maybe fall by the wayside. I do obviously also understand, I think we all do, that there's a long academic history of measuring and modeling carbon. We have many more tools and to actually get accurate results, let's say, or more accurate results, and be able to understand better what's happening on the ground. And there's obviously a very strong correlation between soil organic carbon and all of these other co-benefits. But I feel that to be completely blind to the others and to have this tunnel vision is maybe a misplaced focus. The second is that for project developers who want to issue carbon credits, there's quite a reductive definition of regenerative agriculture or even climate farming. So I'm most familiar with the gold standard SOC framework methodology, so I can speak to that, and I think it's quite similar in other approaches. But the challenge that we face is that basically, because gold standard has activity modules, there's a very narrow definition of what regenerative agriculture or what carbon farming could be. This means that if you just do one thing, like zero tillage, for example, but you continue to use a large amount of organic or inorganic chemicals and agrochemicals and plant protection products and fungicides, which are destroying the soil life, you would still technically qualify for carbon farming and for, in some sense, regenerative agriculture, because this definition is so narrow. And I understand that there's also a huge challenge in actually trying to put together all of these complex activities that make up regenerative agriculture, but there is a challenge when we define it so narrowly that basically in order to issue a carbon credit, we have to just do the bare minimum. So at Carboneg, we don't think that it's necessarily enough to just do no tillage for 10 years and then to call yourself a regenerative farmer or to say that you're doing holistic sort of land management. And under some of the certification schemes, that is actually possible. And I think that creates a strange incentive because we're sort of incentivizing for the bare minimum as opposed to a holistic approach. And I think the third thing, which we'll talk about much more, is how nascent any sort of biodiversity markets are. There's many proposals across the world. This is a map that I took from a report by Pollination, which is a foundation that focuses on nature markets and biodiversity markets. They have some really good resources that I would recommend having a look at. And they've outlined, I think it's about 20, I think Axel has a slide on this as well, but different approaches across the world to how we could actually quantify biodiversity or nature and create some sort of a market, some sort of a credit for that. This is, at this stage, my understanding is that there's very little clarity about how this would actually work, how we would even quantify biodiversity, if we should, in fact, even attempt to quantify biodiversity, because there's some controversies around even the concept of a credit. Is it fungible? Is that a problem? Can we actually sell this biodiversity offset? And it feels to me at this stage, as a project developer who wants to try and emphasize more holistic practices, you have a problem, right? You don't have the old world is dying and the new world is yet to be born. We don't have a framework, we don't have a pathway to actually incentivize these kinds of practices. And this makes it very, very difficult. So what have we done? Actually, before I say that, there are also some hopeful signals, let's say, that are coming from the market. And this is by no means a robust analysis. This is some anecdotal evidence I have from working with buyers and working in the sale of carbon credits. And what I will say is that two things I think have caught my attention, and these both come from on-the-ground experience talking to people. Mostly we deal with marketplaces, actually. And the idea here is that instead of the compensatory model, so offsetting emissions in one supply chain directly, 1 ton for 1 ton, companies are now also looking at beyond value chain mitigation. So essentially investing in nature protection or nature projects that are outside of their value chain, where they can compensate for nature protection, basically. Make contributions instead of compensations. And this, for example, some of the marketplaces that we've been working with have set up nature funds. Instead of us selling credits, we can contribute the outcomes that we have to these funds, and those can be invested in by their buyers. And then they can make, instead of compensation claims, those clients can make claims about the contributions they're making to protecting nature. The other thing is that there's definitely, I think the world of just buying the cheapest possible offsets is behind us, luckily, and companies realize that spending €2 on a credit is actually a huge risk for them, and people are going to call them out and have been calling companies out, and that's a great thing. And the emphasis on quality, I think, is a very good market signal for everyone here. And we've had very positive responses from our customers when it comes to our regenerative index, basically being able to tell a story, having a narrative at this stage which can describe the extra work that we're doing, that our farmers are doing, and people are much more interested in buying those types of credits than the cheapest possible avoidance or reduction credits. And because of all of these challenges and these sort of market signals, we've come up with some sort of imperfect pragmatism, I'm calling it, that we want to try and motivate for more holistic practices and create richer narratives that can support our definition of quality, basically. And I'll go very quickly through this. It's a little bit maybe technical, but we basically have two indexes: a field care index for croplands and a pasture care index for people that have pastures in our program. And we have 3 categories of practices and 5 levels of improvement. And basically, using this matrix, we can assign a score to each farmer for the kind of work that they're doing and the kind of improvements that they make. So with field care, we focus on soil cultivation, crop diversity, the family diversity, the soil coverage, a whole lot of indexes there that we try and we collect the data. It's self-reported from the farmer every year. We try and validate as much of that we can through remote observation. And then what we do, and this is the pasture care index. What we do is we assign a score, and for each of the categories, there's a weighting, basically. So some of these indexes have higher weightings, which means that they would get higher rewards. And essentially, what we do is that we have a compensation. We have a baseline compensation for each of the farmers in our program, and they can get up to 30% more reward for each ton of carbon that they sequester based on how they performed and how their index is calculated. So I didn't want to go into all the maths, but basically you can have the minimum reward as a farmer that we set as a baseline. Depending on which country you're in, there's a multiplier, there's a coefficient for the country, and then that is multiplied then by 30% bonus based on your regenerative index. And yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. I think we have a look at the time, and maybe we'll open for 1 or 2 questions specifically, and then we can take more general questions at the end of all 3.
Yeah, I just want to raise an issue about credits generally and offsetting. And it does create a problem for the farming and agriculture industry in that every time a credit goes out of the agriculture into some other sector, it means that the other sector looks better when you come to the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And the farming sector looks worse and worse. And more fingers point at the farming sector and say you are the villains of the piece and that you are the one sector that's not doing better. And we've already seen, I come from Northern Ireland, and we've already seen in the last 5 years, Northern Ireland, that agriculture is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in Northern Ireland as a sector. And the percentage that we produce has grown from 24% to 27% in 5 years because other sectors are either taking action themselves or because we are losing credits from agriculture. And I wonder what your feeling is about that, and that you are actually part of this process of credits moving out of agriculture and into other sectors.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And it raises the question of, which has been raised many times at the summit around the difference between offsetting and insetting.
Yeah.
And Many projects developers seem to focus on insetting. We've taken a slightly different approach, and I understand that there's pitfalls that come from the removals now contributing elsewhere to someone else's scope 3 emissions. So the subtle distinction here is that we don't actually, any reductions, basically, that would be as a result of moving to regenerative agriculture. So anything from the reductions related to using less fertilizer, plant protection products, so on, less fuel because you're not tilling as much, those could actually be claimed still as reductions within that supply chain. And I think that's important. So the removals for us should be relatively, we don't really, I don't think that necessarily those removals have to stay within the supply chain of agriculture. We can debate that. But I do think that the reductions can be accounted within that same supply chain. And that's still, we still account for that. Many other project developers that are issuing credits will actually bundle those two things together, which is very, very complicated actually, because they should be dealt with completely separately. And we try and make that very clear. Anything else?
Thank you. Great.
Yes,
Thank you.
where do you find the funds that goes up to 30% bonus? Do you found the funds to get the bonus for the farmers when they get the good practices?
That comes from the sale of the credit. So we don't sell for the entire, we don't provide the farmer with the entire value of the credit. Okay. And there's some margin that we keep. So we try to give the farmer 70% of the sales price of the credit, and 30% stays with us for the for operations and our costs. And that extra 30% actually that contributes to up to 70% of the total amount of the credit. So that's
Thank you.
Okay. Could you? Okay. Thank you, Paul, because you facilitated even my presentation. It was very nice. I really appreciate. And as I mentioned, I'm representing Cà Colonna. That is a commercial farm in North Italy. We are located in the Emilia-Romagna region. We produce vegetable and organic vegetable. We started to manage this farm almost 10 years ago. It was a traditional farm, 40 hectares, and with chemicals, a lot of irrigation to produce vegetables. And gradually we convert it in organic, and we build also the facility for the packing, and we supply directly the supermarkets, large supermarkets in Italy and in Europe. And so we start to the approach of organic carbon farming 8 years ago, 7 years ago, through a project Life Carbon Farming Scheme in Europe in collaboration with Finland. And now we are continuing this experience, improving the carbon farming, the capture, and for many reasons we see it. And we collaborate with the university institution for this issue to improve the quality and fertility of soil, because it's the starting point for doing business, since we are supported by our revenue, not from CAP or other money. And our vision of biodiversity, when we talk about diversity, I like the vision that you mentioned. We talk about genetics, but it's just a part of it. Since if we restore genetics, we need also to restore the ecosystem where the genetic or the species are growing or they live. And the other side, the third leg of this vision is a culture, because we have to restore also our tradition, how to use, how to farm, how to cook, how to eat this biodiversity. So biodiversity is not just a matter of genetics, a kind of a living museum. is a matter of a living system where we are part of it. And that's why when we talk on innovation agriculture in the value chain, we adopt a value chain approach according to your question. So our target is not to sell credits or external benefit for the financial market, but to improve the added value of our product to the final consumer. So we need to adopt a fully integrated value chain of innovation. That's I'm fully in line with you, starting from the land, the territory, landscape, agriculture, processing, and final consumer, education to final consumer. And first reason to adopt this approach of carbon farming, and of course including biodiversity in the soil, not for selling credit, but to restore the fertility of soil. What happened in Italy, and I used to say in South Europe, since the last 16 years, we are losing productivity to the impact of climate change we are suffering, and the poor condition of our soil. The average of organic matter we have in Italy, in South Europe, is less than 1% of organic matter in the soil, and the total factor productivity is negative, on average of minus 1% per year. So if we put more genetic, more water, more fertilizer, more pesticide, more of whatever you want, we got minus 1%. With a trend that is accelerating the last 2 years, that is about minus 1.52% per year. So that is the first reason to restore the productivity of farm. We need to start from to restore the living habit of our soils. So when we talk about this organic carbon and biodiversity of soil, I'm talking about just this part of this aspect of biodiversity inside the soil. That is a criteria to improve the sustainability of soil. We talk about in situ soil services. So in the framework of ecosystem service, we have two aspects. In situ, that is the private part of our farming, and ex situ soil service, that is the public component, public benefit. In this case, we can also use the credit to enter in this kind of market. So two faces but of the same coin, so I used to say. But the final consideration is that we must have a living soil. Soil must be alive and so there are different criteria to evaluate because our final target is to measure in some way for the economic purpose the fertility of our soil in terms of carbon that we are able to fix and by the biodiversity as well. There are different methodology in economics and econometrics for direct market evaluation, revealed preferences like hedonic price that we used in this case, and starting preference. We use these techniques in order to see the inner value of the component of the soil. It's just one approach. It's not the full scenario of portfolio techniques. That is an econometric model we use. It's a simple balance of energy that we put in the soil, we take from the soil, and we stock in the soil. That's to measure the final carbon we can stock for a long time in the soil. When we long time means at least 10 years. Now we have an experience of 6 years of stocking, and we see the result. The role of biodiversity in this context. Biodiversity, we managed to include the biodiversity inside it and to measure. The first step is to measure through the soil analysis, just simple as a difference between organic matter and organic carbon. This difference, we call it microbiome of the soil, is a proxy. It's not exactly, so scientists can complain, but we need to, as economists, we need to simplify the index and use it in order to have some kind of value at the end of the story. But I realize that is quite really a proxy. Is not exactly an exact measure, but it could be an estimation for this kind of model. Now we in the next year, next year, we also enlarge the collaboration to measure in different way and through eDNA, DNA or other criteria to evaluate better the component, biodiversity component of the soil. But is just a starting point, this one. And the role of organic matter is to interact with the component of organic carbon in order to stabilize it inside the soil, since it's a way to improve the stock in the long term, and of course to improve the fertility. That is our first target. Criteria, I fully appreciate the criteria, the ecosystem services you mentioned, and so we start from requirement, soil quality parameter. We reintroduce crop rotation. We reduce the use of water, applying drip irrigation. We cover the soil during the farming season of the crop with bioplastic mulching. Also cover crops in winter time. So the first strategy is to preserve the quality of soil. We produce our own compost in the farm using the poultry manure. We are in an area where we don't have livestock, but other farm around has livestock, chicken, hens, especially hens, is a good manure. But we compost it with a vegetable component in our farm. Other strategy and so so this is a crop rotation during the year is just a picture. We adopt precision farming. All our machines are controlled by satellite control system, and we just transplant the plant, putting the pipeline for deep irrigation, covered with the matching bioplastic, and then transplant or soil. That's it. So no chemicals at all, no herbicides, and so the soil is covered. The average of irrigation, even in the very dry season, we have in the Mediterranean area now, we use about 2 millimeters of water per day, no more, with respect to the 12-15 millimeters that when the farm was in conventional system. And so that's the approach. Economic value, ex situ economic value. That means in terms of soil, organic carbon. We could improve the organic carbon in the soil more than 1%. So we move from 1 to 3% on average. And if we consider 1% with our soil that's quite heavy, claims and so on, it's about 40 tons per hectare in 5 years. We could stock, it's a lot. And so using an average price of €6, we have a potential value of €2,000 per hectare. That is a potential value in 5 years. It's a lot. But as I mentioned, is a value we don't want from credit. We want to put as added value to our product. We sell to supermarkets in Italy and Europe, as I mentioned. That's a criteria. In situ value. As I mentioned, we are losing 1% of the productivity in Italy per year. That means it's about half billion euro of value per year we are losing in value term. And that is an average of €45 per hectare. And so if we restore 1%, we restore €45 per hectare of value. That is the real value we look for. Another to stabilize, to restore and stabilize the yield. And so we are conscious, we are in a situation where the Sahara Desert is moving up from Africa to the Mediterranean area. And we cannot stop it. Well, we can manage to farm in different way in order to be more resilient, and our soil is the starting point to be resilient. So that's the real value to stabilize our production. So some final consideration for discussion with you. We have to combine different agronomic practices and work with a perspective of at least 5-10 years, at least, not even though with our revenue coming from every year we farm. And the role of soil biodiversity is to capture and maintaining the carbon stock in the soil and restore the soil fertility. That is the main point. And so other value we have to work, and we start to work, is to better evaluate, to have a better evaluation of economics of biodiversity and traceability. We start now to work on blockchain in order to have a full traceability from the soil, the characteristic of the soil, in order to embed the quality of soil inside the quality of the product and provide it to the final consumer. We have many certifications, so we are not looking for new certification, but we managed to include the carbon farming approach inside the organic certification. That is regulation 848 of 2018 or Global Gap and so on. And so to use the tools we already have to communicate to the final consumer the value of ecosystem, the value of ecosystem service and the land and the soil we have. Thank you. Some burning question, otherwise, please.
Thank you a lot for this presentation. So you have a huge amount of carbon increase in a few years. As far as I understood, 8 tons per hectare per year. Something
Yeah,
like
40 tons in 5 years.
5 years, yeah.
That is plus we have 1% more of organic carbon in the soil.
Which is really impressive. So my question is, how much exogenous inputs do you have from your, let's say, farm? Since you said that we use compost and you use poultry manure plus I think you composted other
Some
things.
vegetable.
So
Yeah.
how much come from biomass or carbon come from let's say outside your biomass? Because to increase such a rate of carbon sequestration, you also need a lot of input. So I was wondering how much come from.
We use about 40 tons of compost we produce in our farm. In the beginning, we start to use it every year, but the compost coming from poultry manure is the pH is quite high, and our soil have a high pH and high salinity. So we have to reduce. Now we use alternative year. 1 year we use compost, another year we use cover crop and cover, especially in winter time, and so we have to alternate external input, organic external input, or internal like cover crop. To protect the soil, in order to reduce, to improve the acidity, to also reduce the salinity of the soil. That is like a key point in our soil, in our land.
I have a question in understanding of your calculation. Thank you.
It's not calculation, it's a measure. We just analyze.
Yeah, just the formula you have.
The formula is to address the strategy and the protocol we use. The formula is just a balance.
Yeah,
the final value are analysis of the soil.
Yeah. So just maybe I have a good news for you, because what you had was 60 euros per tons. It's per CO2 and not per carbon. So you have to multiply it with 3.6 and you have even higher earnings because it's 60 euros per ton of CO2 and not of carbon.
Yeah,
So
we
you
convert
have
in CO2 and not the rest in carbon.
So
because
organic is CO2?
yeah.
Okay.
Just the organic carbon converted in CO2, and all the formula is based on the conversion of inputs like yield, crop, biomass that's still in the soil, and all inputs are converted in energy in order to have the same measure inside the formula. But we use the formula to address the strategy in the field, not to calculate the final results. It's not a model. It's a budget for us. And then, since it's just a farm, it's not a landscape, a huge landscape. For the later, we measure the final result as analysis. For analysis. Of course, we have to move further from direct analysis. Okay, thank you. Axel, it's your turn.
If I can maybe ask you for the slides again. And we had two fantastic examples that were more within the farming context. And now I'm going to speak more around the forestry context. And just out of interest in the room, if I can have a show of hands of people that are maybe more in the forestry part. Okay. Oh, it's funny. You're almost all here. And one person there. Okay, great. Fantastic. So first, let me quickly introduce what we do. We are a reforestation company, so that means we work on very degraded land, and here you see some examples of the kind of terrains that we work on. And basically, we bring back, we reforest, so it's only on places where there used to be a forest, but it's typically on lands that were so degraded that they're just not coming back on their own. So you would have maybe some lands that used to be productive, but for a number of reasons are no longer productive. You have land that has been really hit by catastrophic fires, which means that they are just not coming back. And you also have land that has been affected by diseases or pests. So basically, in this land, our goal is to bring a forest back. We work only with natural species, and our goal is to native species, and our goal is to bring a natural forest back and to revive an ecosystem. So to give you a sense of what it can look like, here is an example of a land that a project we started in 2019, and a couple of years back, you see the trees have come up. They're nice trees, they're really starting to grow, and wanted to give a sense, all the colors and the different shapes that you see is because this is not a monoculture. This is really trying to bring back as close as we can to the original ecosystem, the many different species that used to be there. And of course, we do that looking ahead, thinking about some of the changes that the climate is already affected by, so that we know we try to bring ones that are a little bit more resilient but are still native. So for us, and I agree also, the term carbon farming sometimes feels a little bit odd with what we're doing here, but the goal was always to bring back an ecosystem. And this is very important because otherwise, if you think only about carbon, and the tunnel that Paul was sharing earlier, unfortunately has in parts of the market taken place, you will go and just put a monoculture of a species that will be capturing a lot of carbon, but this really does not bring back the ecosystem. So for us from the start, it's always been this idea that we want to bring the ecosystem back. Carbon, of course, is at this point the best way. We have to fund and monetize those projects, but we wanted to do a bit more. And it's been so far, Land Life has existed for 10 years, so a lot of it was really trying to convince people on the value of bringing an ecosystem back. All of the points that Giancarlo and Paul mentioned earlier about the co-benefits. What we're starting to see, and we think that's an exciting sign of the evolution of the market, is that there may be more enablers to unlock biodiversity as a means of financing, right? As a means towards more restoration. So first, we see that there are more and more frameworks coming up that really try to quantify and to explain, what is biodiversity, what is the baselining, and how you measure the progress that is made on a biodiversity perspective. You have new technologies that are available to do this measurement and to quantify it, which is exciting because maybe a couple of years back it was more showing pictures of traces of animals that we had on our sites, and it makes for a very nice slide, but it's not really fully quantified. And the third bit is that we're also seeing more discerning customers and buyers who are starting to understand that, yes, of course, carbon is important, but there is a whole lot of other things that we need to do, and that they're starting to value these elements and to bring more nature positive thinking into their climate action. So I wanted to share a little bit more of what we see. We indeed see, we have not counted them all, and there are some reports that try to show all of this, but there is now a lot of methodologies that try to capture, and all of them grapple a little bit with the same thing, which is unlike carbon, biodiversity is more complex. You have way more dimensions that you need to take into consideration, and it is biome or bioregion specific. So how do you account for all that complexity but still make it simple enough that we can work with? And I think this is where there is a spectrum. Some are more simple, but maybe you lose some of the richness. Some are more complex, but they're much harder to operationalize and to use as a developer. Overall, I think we're seeing two types of approaches. One which is really around making more a statement, is to say, right, there is a rating, it's more a label, a proof of quality of the project, and this is where you see, for example, the global biodiversity standard being there, or also the FSC. And then you have some that are taking more a credit approach, and these would be going towards a biodiversity credit approach, where the goal there is to say, okay, we will really be quantifying, and that becomes this unit that you can really calculate and eventually monetize. Now, of course, there are a lot of questions on, is a unit of, what is really truly a unit of biodiversity, and does a unit of biodiversity in Spain compare to a unit of biodiversity in Australia or somewhere else? So that's also very different from carbon. But there are, some benefits to this where you can really get to also a monetization that can help. So I think this is what we're seeing. I don't know, this is all very nascent. I don't know that the market has really chosen yet which way it wants to go. But this is what we're seeing at the moment. Now, to share with you yes, I thought maybe before going into the details, maybe to remind everyone that for biodiversity, just like, we have this mitigation hierarchy, there is a similar one around biodiversity, and you can see, where the credits would fall, which is, of course, after doing a whole lot of activities to make sure that you reduce some unfortunate consequences otherwise. The second thing I mentioned was that there are a lot of new monitoring technologies which also make it easier to take stock of how much biodiversity there is in an environment. And that is also exciting. There are a lot of startups working on those and trying to make them more operational and trying to reduce the cost. I think probably maybe you've heard around bioacoustics or eDNA, probably also in the farming context, that's something you look at, which also open up our ability to quantify, and not only to show a picture of a nice bird that came back, but really quantify, this is a fungi in the soil, these are the the other vertebrates, invertebrates, and really give that richer picture of what biodiversity is. So there I wanted to share with you, we are trying also to find our way, maybe a bit unlike you. We are not working with productive forests, so really this restoration is what we're bringing back. And so we are really trying to see how we can bring more funds towards restoration in a good way. So we took part, and we were selected. Actually, it was a quite selective process, but we were selected to be part of a pilot that Vera did for their new framework. It's a framework that launched last year. Which is the nature framework, and which is around this, leading. It can lead towards those biodiversity credits in the end. So the approach we took is that you need to have multiple measurement dimensions. Those are the ones that we took for Spain, where we looked at soil health, vegetation health, and the landscape characteristics. And then we have, of course, some good old methods like the field survey, fail-safe, which is very good for ground truthing. But we also have some more, technology-based solution or methods like the satellite imagery, but also the eDNA. And the picture you see at the bottom is my colleague, taking the samples of the eDNA on that ground. And what you want to do is that you really want to do this baselining before you start any reforestation work, so that you know where you're starting from, which, as you can see in our cases, is really soils and landscape that are very degraded, if not barren. Now, you of course need to have a benchmark, right? Because how do you know that you're making progress? And that's a huge element of ultimately getting to those credits, is to show that you are having actual impact on the land. So this is kind of the degraded area, and then a lot of the exercise is really also about setting the right benchmark. Ideally, you have a forest nearby that will be, exactly the right benchmark for you. This is becoming, rarer and rarer to some extent. So for us, we took composites of nearby forests that we brought together so that we can say, this is what we aspire to becoming again on that land. And then basically that leads you to create, this kind of view as part of a theory of change, where you say, this is where we are today, and this is where we want to go in terms of biodiversity recovery, and therefore this is our path, and this is what we expect our project to do and to be. And here again, you can have many charts. It can get very scientific very, very quickly. I think what I wanted to bring here is that when we think about the reforestation and how biodiversity comes into a reforestation project, I think there are many ways that this can be built. To date, we have worked primarily in restoring areas that typically were adjacent to other, to productive areas, and that we know, right, will bring some of these big ecosystem benefits, this public good ecosystem benefits beyond just the area that we are restoring, so also to the value chain nearby, bringing it more resilience towards climate changes. Second is that we know in some farming contexts there are some parts of the farms that are not as productive, or some part of the timber activity that are just not as productive anymore for whatever reasons, and that might be something that could get converted back to just a pure restoration and carbon credits. And we'll talk about that if there are some biodiversity credits could support in funding that work and making it economically viable. And then there are also these thoughts around doing some green veining, which of course historically in Europe there was a lot of, right, in all of our farming landscape, but in many countries they are no longer there, and about bringing them back into your different farming context to also get some of those benefits. So in terms of what it would bring, of course, the idea would be that it would bring additional revenue, because right now there is just not enough funding that goes into these landscape restoration, especially as all of the cost, if you will, is very much upfront, right? All of the cost is there. This would be de-risking the value chain, which is important to also bring more benefits to the productive parts. And of course then listing, but you showed very nice pictures on this earlier, Paul, the different ecosystem benefits that, of less soil erosion and etc. So I think this is how we are thinking about doing the work. This is how we are trying right now to find, what is the reasonable way to do this from an ecological perspective, what makes sense, right? From an operational perspective, what is it that we can really work with in a scalable manner as a project developer, and from a pure market perspective, right, on what will customers ultimately want and support. Let me maybe pause here and see if there are questions on our activities. Yes.
Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. Do you think there could be a link with agriculture, because you're presenting restoration activities in quite preserved areas? Sorry, that is very, very useful, but do you see a link that we could build with agriculture, because putting back organic carbon in soil is restoring life in the soils also? It's a tricky issue. Could we have a mixed finance from carbon and biodiversity in agriculture? Are you exploring such ways?
Yes, this is exactly what we are trying to think through on how to do this, because just as you say, right, we know that there are benefits that go beyond just the area restore, right, that will be that will benefit to the lands that are, close to it, which, of course, we need productive land, right? We need land that produces food, we need land that produces wood, right? All of those are needed. And I think what we're trying to understand is indeed how to work with those different partners and actors in the domain, and how we can make it together more synergetic in a way. That I think would be very interesting to us. So right now we've been working, adjacent, and the more adjacent, of course, I imagine the more beneficial it would be. But that would be very interesting to us, yes.
And how could we mix the markets? Because we have one market for carbon, one for biodiversity. Do you think CRCF could be the place to mix the two?
Well, that maybe is a nice segue to some of the thought we have, and I'll bring back my colleagues after, but I think that is really one of the big questions to have to discuss together. Thank you. Any other question? Yes, maybe the gentleman, and I'll come to you. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. I think that was you had a very helpful distinction between sort of a biodiversity statement methodology or a distinct biodiversity credit. So just kind of building on this last comment, are you thinking about having sort of a biodiversity premium on a carbon credit, essentially, or having it as a separate biodiversity credit?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's really, I think, is the core question that we're all a little bit grappling with, right? So right now there are multiple ways you can do this, and they use the terms of either you either have bundling, which is there all together, you can be stacking, and you could be, then selling separately. I think for us, we're also trying to form an opinion on it. I think it requires quite a bit of thinking on, what could be the consequences, good and bad, of those different models. For us right now, our thought was really if we were going to go with credits, and also we want to see what our customers are telling us of whether they want a credit or whether they're just okay with a statement. Our thought was to link them together, to sell them as one, because of course they are somewhat quite connected, and we would prefer to keep that integrity together. So that was our current thinking, indeed. But then the questions of still having, a credit one and a carbon one, I think still remains a very big question of what will work best. And I think, gentlemen here, at the last question.
It's a comment rather than a question, and it's about on your use of technologies. We have been using aerial LiDAR, not the ground-based LiDAR, for measuring above-ground biomass, which is a way of linking the biodiversity and forestry work you are doing to actually, the carbon that you are sequestering and measuring it and monitoring it over a period of time, because you can go back and repeat that year after year, or every like 5-year intervals or whatever, to record the growth in biomass and therefore the carbon stored above ground. And I think there's huge potential there. And so the whole of Northern Ireland has now been surveyed to measure the above ground biomass under the soil nutrient health scheme, as opposed to a pilot site.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wasn't aware. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Many thanks for your presentation and congratulations for this project you have in Spain. I wanted to ask 2 questions regarding this project. One is if this project is already registered and validated under this new better nature scheme. And the other one is how do you manage the property? So if those lands are land-life lands, or if you, if not, how do you involve this municipality land or private land, and how do the property participate also in the project design, implementation, etc., and also in the revenues?
Yeah, of course. So we do not buy the land. We also believe that the land needs to belong to the local landowners. So we work in Spain, in the case of Spain, with municipalities that typically do not have the means, whether financial nor technical, to be funding the restoration or executing it. So we are very close partners with them. And so, of course, when you follow all these processes, there is always stakeholder engagement. That is always a core part on the carbon side, and even more on the biodiversity side. In those, at least in what Vera has put together, you have to show even more proof of your engagement. With the community. In terms of this specific project, we have not registered it because we were in the pilot phase, and one of the key initial key learnings was that you needed to really do it before any restoration started, and we did it because before it wasn't there. We did, I think, 1 year after we had started some work. So now we have to see whether, now there is a bit more lenience to maybe going back, but we are deciding whether that's something we want to do or whether we will start with just a brand new project. And maybe just last question before we move on to the full group discussion, because we wanted to share with you some of the thoughts we had preparing this and some of the recommendations. But please.
Okay, thank you. Do you have an idea about the value of biodiversity for the market?
Yeah. So this is where it's very, very nascent. Some numbers I've seen, and I think there is a very wide area. But I've seen some number from some projects where it was around, I think it was between 40 and 60 euros per unit. Per unit of biodiversity, whatever unit they were using.
That unit, how do you evaluate the unit? Because, as you said, biodiversity is rather complex. Yeah. How can we create a unit that is comparable? Or
yeah. I mean, that's the whole crux of all those methodologies, right? Is how do I define a unit? So each methodology goes about it slightly differently, but usually it's about making sufficient amount of progress right within a given time frame, and then that becomes a unit on a specific land area. I think each of them does it very, slightly differently, and those are, to be fair, some fairly complex calculations. And I think this is where, also all these methodologies really try to think about how do I bring the full complexity of biodiversity of the different biomes of something that can work across, but still be operational on the ground. And I think some of them use slightly different approaches. So, yeah.
Just to elaborate, because you have showed a photo from a forest station in, I believe it was in Australia.
Yes.
So it was 12 species, I believe.
Yes, a little bit more. I think it was
15 species.
Yeah.
So the question that sometimes confuses me is, when you plant the trees, you put 15 species.
Yes.
But on the first year, on the second year, suddenly you have to plant again because some of them are dead during the time. The value of planting in the first, second, or third year is the same that is in the 12th year?
I think maybe this is a very specific question. Maybe we take it separately together. Happy to speak with you, because I think just in view of time, right? Maybe I will ask Gianluca and Paul to come back.
So we've wanted to set up a discussion here about some of the recommendations. We've got some thoughts or some interpretations of the CRCF, and the emphasis here is how do we make sure to enshrine biodiversity and co-benefits within the CRCF. So what approaches could we take, what recommendations could we make in order to make sure that we don't have the carbon blindness or tunnel vision? And our interpretation of the CRCF right now is that it deals with these aspects in three ways. The first is that there's a do no harm requirement. So any of the carbon projects need to make sure that they don't actively degrade biodiversity, and things like monocrop plantations, for example, would not be considered certifiable. The second is to ensure that there are actually biodiversity co-benefits generated by these projects. And the third aspect is to create incentives for biodiversity. Now, our understanding is that these are still to be defined. They haven't been completely resolved. There's some recommendations out there. I attended a very productive panel yesterday where some recommendations were made how to approach some of these things. But in the next few minutes, we would like to describe some of our sort of premises that we've discussed and some of the recommendations that we've put together as we've tried our best, let's say. We're definitely not competent enough to come up with the perfect recommendations, and we wanted to open the floor to all of you to kind of in a collegial way share our thoughts, share our ideas, share the challenges, and hopefully also share our experiences in some of these challenges. So these are some of the, I don't know if you want to take over from here. But
well, yeah, we can just exchange. Yes, so we thought, to be honest, to go straight into the recommendations, it was not so easy. You know, all the recommendation, you needed a little bit of grain of salt. It was not perfect. So we thought, let's maybe start with what we think to be very aligned on or be very clear about. And hopefully you being in this session is also something that you see and that you recognize. First is that biodiversity brings these positive ecosystem services that are really critical to a lot of the productive activities that take place on land. The second is that biodiversity is inherently more complex to measure than carbon, right? Or it's very clear what a carbon ton is, and it's the same everywhere around the world, right? Biodiversity is also very biome specific. So, and when you think about all of it, here we're talking about land, but there is also a lot of biodiversity that takes place in water, right? So you also have a lot of thinking that goes around, you know, ocean biodiversity. So they're also trying to find solutions that work for everything. But fair enough, here we're about land. The second thing is that probably, you know, integrating biodiversity in your practices, right? When you're working around carbon, to be frank, it does take more work, it takes more resources, and it can lead, in the case of forestry, right, potentially to lower returns as well, because you are going to plant multiple species, right, and not all of them bring the highest carbon yield, right? So for your business case, to some extent,
if you are just thinking about carbon, you would do a certain thing. But if you think more holistically, as the visual that Paul showed earlier, you will make a different design choice around what you're going to be planting. The carbon credit pricing today does not really fully reflect the value of biodiversity. Which means it doesn't necessarily bring all the right incentives to the farmers, the foresters, the project developers to really fully embrace and go for biodiversity. And as we've seen, right, the biodiversity market on its own is very nascent, so it's also not bringing all this funding at the moment. And I think where we wanted to left it is with a sense of urgency, right? That we cannot really wait. We should be taking action early and quickly because the degradation is already quite high. We often use this number that 2 billion hectares of degraded soil around the world, right? This is like a very big number, and it is increasing. So how do we structure things so that we make a difference? Maybe just to stop here, is anyone disagrees with any of those premises or wants to add some additional ones?
Maybe do I need the microphone to the
I think we can hear you.
So the people online can hear you as well.
Okay, well, my name is Vanessa Sanchez and I work in Fundación Global Nature back in Spain. And I totally agree with you when you said we have to avoid the tunnel vision. But I think with these recommendations we are incentivizing this tunnel vision. I mean, I'm sure it's difficult. We all think that we cannot measure biodiversity gains in our ecosystems, but in my foundation we have been working during the last 4 or 5 years in a methodology together with agro-industry to measure biodiversity gains in our ecosystem in semi-arid habitats. And we know we have to use a basket of metrics. It's not so difficult. We don't have to use on a specific baseline just in year 0 because biodiversity depends in our ecosystems on the, for instance, the weather conditions or if it's a good or a bad year, but we know how to do it, and we are gonna publish in the following months the methodology in open. We are trying to speak with Preferred by Nature, SGS, and other. So just to let you know that we will have something that you could apply in your projects, and I think we should ask the Commission to integrate co-benefits on biodiversity because it's important, and there are different ways of doing carbon farming, and there are ways that could harm biodiversity and ways that could not harm biodiversity, and we have to push in that direction. And I think it's wrong if we are gonna, because farmers, when you are a farmer and you have a farm, you do practices, and your practices could be positive for carbon and positive for biodiversity or for soil or for everything. And we should give them the answer to measure that. I mean, the way to can measure and give a value to that. I mean, if you have co-benefits on biodiversity, then your credits should have a higher value. I think we should push on that direction, and just to let you know, I will try to send you the documents we are working on with these biodiversity gains methodologies to measure on our ecosystems, because we will publish it in our website and so on, and we are on that. It's a long work from the last 4 or 5 years, and we still don't have something to publish, but we will have it in the 2 following months, and I will share it with you because there is a way to do it, and I think we should try to go in that direction, not going on the direction on just giving credits for carbon, because we should integrate the co-benefits on biodiversity. It can be done. It's not so expensive. You can do it at farm level. Something similar to the regenerative index. You are applying, and we should try to push the Commission on that direction more than on the carbon tunnel vision.
But I think that's very much what we're saying, right? Is that it needs to be, recognized and valued in the right way, and that the way it is today is not quite fully doing this, which means that it's not fully embraced yet, right, by all developers. I don't think I think you were quite aligned then with the premises we were putting here.
Yeah, because in the last premise you said something like we need to act fast, so we cannot ensure to measure co-benefits on biodiversity, but I think there are a lot of work on there. I mean, on biodiversity credits and what Commission wants to call nature credits, and I think we should push on that direction. Like
okay, maybe then a slight wording.
That last sentence makes me think like, go ahead with carbon credits and we'll see how to include co-benefits on biodiversity, but there is information on how to do it, and it's not so difficult. I mean,
no, I think that was definitely, maybe it's just a wording piece, but it's obviously you see all of us doing that today. Good to hear that there is another methodology coming. I think to some extent we have a lot of methodologies, right, that are available, some of them easier to deploy than others, but it's great. There is a lot of science and knowledge that starts to come through, and now it's really about how we translate that in the marketplace so that we can really have and bring the funding and the revenues to the farmers, to the foresters, so that it is deployed. I think that's, from my view, this is where right now it's not fully there yet.
It makes it easy for farmers to use it. I mean, you cannot say farmer you can go for biodiversity credits, you can go for carbon credits, you can go for. I mean, they should go for ecosystem services at all. And
maybe you could just repeat the name of your organization and to thank you for your important work on this as well.
Yeah, it's Fundación Global Nature, Global Nature, based in Spain.
Thank you.
I don't know. Any other questions or?
Could I just add to that slightly, and that is worry about continuing biodiversity loss. And for farmers, it's not necessarily their individual fault. And so if you're recording on a single farm, it may be because they have an oasis of good habitat that is surrounded by a desert of poor habitat with no connectivity in it. And I think there needs to be some recognition that they cannot be held individually responsible for further biodiversity loss, and it may make biodiversity gain extremely difficult for them because they can't. It's not within the landscape. They are the only people or the only area that is actually suitable for a lot of the biodiversity. I mean, I find that my own farm, I've lost a number of species of birds and animals that simply cannot survive in the surrounding landscape. They need a bigger area or a corridor of conductivity to get to the habitat. And I just don't know how you write that in or keep that in, but I think it needs to be thought about somewhere in the process.
I want to say, I think it's a very, very good point. Those biolinks, right, are essential for. We try to do our projects, in a way that you would create ultimately those biolinks. But you're right, there needs to be this landscape level thinking, and that also brings to the question that was asked earlier, right? How do we bring all the pieces together? Because we need productivity, we need natural. So how do we connect all of this so that at the end, overall, it works?
Maybe we have the answer over here.
So I'm here as a farmer and an innovator, and listening to, I don't know how many of you listened to Sheila this morning, but I believe it is possible that we farm biodiverse ecosystems and be productive. Now that's a big thing to say because for the last 120, 150 years we have been monocropping or moving in that direction. And suddenly we've arrived here with a very small number of plants dominating the ecosystem. Actually, there is no ecosystem. It is just the monoculture. And we talk here about how we have biodiversity around that. It is my contention, and if I will go back to what Sheila said this morning, you can have productive ecosystems which actually produce food. It requires a fundamental different way of thinking. It is ultimately better for the farmer because it has the potential to take down the cost of you can be quite productive. It is difficult. They are very difficult to manage. It was talked about this morning. We don't have the agronomists who are independent to give the advice to show how this is done and to help us to develop that. I mean, I'm going around searching for that agronomy advice. I'm finding it, more of it, in the literature of the 18th century, where they weren't able to dominate nature. We didn't have the mechanical or chemical means to do that, and they farmed in a different way. And we have the potential, and I said potential, to farm in a very different way. And we wouldn't be just thinking about one element of carbon farming, but we would be thinking about producing high quality food, affecting nature and the natural ecosystems, and impinging on human health directly, making people feel better, and healthier.
Thank you for that.
Sorry, I should have given my name. Sorry. Firstly, I'm a farmer, and we're innovating a system called Fresh Graze, and it allows us to graze animals it allows animals to graze very diverse ecosystems, affecting soil health, and we can see this very clearly and very quickly. I came from a very intensive system, and we see this in animal health really quickly, because it affects, when the soil is healthy, it affects animal health really quickly. And it's just, but it does take a very different way of thinking. It's as big as what remote working is to, previously, many of you had to go to the office each day.
Yep.
Now we have remote working, and that still takes some thinking about how you can be productive doing that. Okay, it's complex.
Yes.
It's more complex. And it's the degree of complexity there that we as farmers need the support to develop and implement these systems.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we maybe get the slides up again? Sorry.
It switched off. Okay. Then maybe in the meantime, I think there was another question until the screen comes back.
We didn't actually get to the recommendations. I think that's the funny part. We just described the premises, and there seems to be a lot of discussion there. But hopefully, we can put up the recommendations before we leave the session.
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
I remember that when the soil health law started to be developed, the measurement for soil biodiversity, I mean, they put this, was soil respiration. And this highlights the complete, this is in English form, an awareness of the complexity of biodiversity in soil, but also in the other systems. Consider that you can measure it just with a single parameter that is anyway not really the right one, because you can have DNA, for example, can be more able to give an idea of the soil complexity. So I think we are very far away from an understanding of biodiversity complexity on my side for soil, but it's applied, I think, for all the systems we are considering, plant, animals, etc. So this should be also, I mean, we should ask that the complexity is considered, and we cannot bring everything to simple indexes and only one to express such different concepts.
Good points. Okay, maybe I see there is a last comment there.
Yeah, no, just had a couple of points.
So I just get the feeling it's a bit hesitant. You know, we're talking about shouldn't we incorporate biodiversity into carbon and stuff. I mean, we're having a massive climate change crisis, and we're in the 6th mass extinction event, and they're intimately linked. They're both sides of the same coin, and it's no coincidence that the most nature-depleted countries are the same countries that have done the most damage in terms of climate. I mean, biodiversity is complex forms of carbon, and all carbon is either live or dead biodiversity, right? So that would be one point. And then also an obvious linkage, so I think it should be a lot bolder. Biodiversity has to be, they can't be separated. I just think that's going down a bad route. So I just agree over there. I think it should be bundled. We can't be stacking it and sell it separately. That's a slippery slope, which can bring in a lot of speculation, which is another issue. And then another obvious linkage as well, just to link the two together clearly, is from another key principle in terms of carbon offsetting or insetting, whatever you want to call it, is the longevity and the permanence. And the best way from an ecological perspective, as probably a lot of people here know, is to have diversity. So if you want to secure long-term carbon storage, and we have that issue here in Ireland, for example, so it's monocultural Sitka spruce, which is a disaster. We have the spruce bark beetles. So to secure carbon in any ecosystem, we need biodiversity. So I really think they should be spoken about in the same breath and on the same, you know, not separately. That's stupid. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the segue.
Strong opinions, love it.
Yeah. All right, shall we go? All right, so yeah, we had a couple of thoughts on how to do this. That, to your point, right, they go together, they should be going together, and there are some concerns if we start, I mean, we saw what the impact of the tunnel vision on carbon does, right, so we do need to get to that more holistic view, and we think this would also make it easier probably for buyers ultimately, right, to buy a simple thing, and also for practitioners, right, rather than having to think about very different schemes that they have to do, but at the same time we need to do it in a way that does reflect the, you know, more complex nature or more biome dependent nature of biodiversity. So I think this is really, yes, integrated, but integrated in a way that makes sense and does not kind of dummy down biodiversity to the point that it also leads to negative side effects. I guess that's where we were landing.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I think there's sort of, we can think of it from a crediting perspective, because I think that's sort of our background, and either you'd have a separate carbon credit and a separate biodiversity credit. I think we've discussed that there's problems with that. This idea of like carbon plus, let's say, a credit that also incorporates some biodiversity benefits into it is a much more, I think, harmonized approach that would avoid some of the pitfalls of the other sort of way of thinking about it.
Yeah, because at the end of the story, we need to come up with the final number that is a profit for the farmers. That's we have to manage the complexity. I fully agree. We need to have a matrix approach on the territory, but at the end of the story, we need to simplify to have a final number. Another consideration, final number also in terms of cost of managing this issue, because if we manage to keep this approach, a complex approach at farmer level, is too expensive for a single farm. That's why my view as a farmer is important to have both levels. Landscape approach that you mentioned, because we need to include also agroforestry, island of biodiversity inside the territory, the landscape, because a single farmer by itself cannot manage this complex. Single farmers need to have final numbers, and so we need to have both approach, institutional level that manage the landscape, and the farmers that manage inside, in situ, as I mentioned, the issue. The final number, we can talk about the credit of biodiversity or carbon credit, to converge the credits. It's a matter of market, supply and demand at the end of the story. And market managed to simplify and have just few issues to trade off. That's the final.
We are on time. We just heard the other team, so maybe one more question or a couple of more reactions, and then of course
yes,
can break
just
for lunch.
one question. Do you have recommendations to bring the gap on the market side, on the demand? Because you mentioned it could increase the prices if you combine or conjure carbon and biodiversity. Do you have recommendations to address the buyers or the demand side, maybe with bonus approaches, or is the end consumer paying in the end? Because now buyers are following carbon prices, not carbon plus biodiversity prices. How are we gonna bring this gap? Do you have ideas?
Maybe I could give 1 second response to that. It was very interesting to hear Mars talking about it yesterday. They had a panel where they're discussing how do we actually quantify this value for the buyers, right? And the idea there was that biodiversity is inextricably linked to the supply chain security. So people who are working in natural capital, they understand that unless they're preserving biodiversity, they have major risks to their supply chain. And I think that this, if it's not already fully happening, these thoughts are very emergent, and there's discussions happening around many corporate boardrooms that realize that they can't just focus on carbon. So we don't have necessarily recommendations about, it should be €5 more for 2 more species, but the idea is that, right, but I think the idea is that the trend is moving that way, that it has to be holistic.
Yeah, and to some point, I mean, this is where also some guidance and the regulation can also push things a little bit in a direction, right? By making sure that biodiversity is well represented, is well captured in EU CRCF on those land activities will also be important on how the buyer then look at it. What we see, and there I echo what Paul mentioned, is that the buyers are starting to much more understand, yes, carbon, but also the rest, and the rest is now starting to have a direct risk on my operations, on my financials, on my own company, longevity in a way. Because if at some point there is no more, whatever one of the ecosystems, they might not be able to produce anymore, right? So I think there is this more maturity in understanding how all these things work together. So we are starting to see more open end buyers for this, but then they also want to be sure then of what they would be buying and how that is truly quantified, or that is truly real. They have learned, right, from the issues of the carbon market, and they have been, a lot of them, suggested to then, backlash publicly, right, when things have gone wrong. So we also have to understand that for them, they want some solidity and things they can rely on the validity of the impact.
We have to build trust on this evaluation.
Yeah. I think that's it. Thank you very much for the very engaged session.